Alicia Johnson sat at her desk, her pencil moving smoothly across the lined paper as she jotted down notes. Her sharp eyes scanned the words on the textbook, soaking in every detail. At 16, Alicia was confident, outspoken, and deeply passionate about her heritage. Westbrook High was home, though it wasn't always easy being one of the few black students. Despite the challenges, Alicia thrived academically. She had big dreams of making a difference in the world through history and justice. "All right, class," Mr. Davis's deep voice rang out. "Today, we'll be discussing the American Revolution. Who can tell me who our founding fathers were?" Alicia's hand shot up eagerly. "John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin," she listed confidently. Mr. Davis nodded, his graying hair a bit messy as he scanned the room. "Yes, those are important figures. But Alicia, what about figures who represent more than just the white perspective? What about voices like Frederick Douglass or Harriet Tubman?" The classroom grew quiet. Some students glanced at each other, unsure of how to respond. Mr. Davis cleared his throat and continued. "We'll stick to the main figures for now. It's important to understand the history of our country as a whole." Alicia frowned slightly, her brow furrowing. "But Mr. Davis, history is more than just one perspective. Black voices matter too. We should learn about them alongside the others." Mr. Davis paused for a moment, adjusting his glasses. "Alicia," he said, his tone firm but not unkind, "I understand your point, but we have a set curriculum. Changing it would cause unnecessary division." Alicia leaned forward slightly, her voice steady. "But isn't that what we need to address? Division? You can't ignore history just because it's uncomfortable." Mr. Davis sighed, his expression thoughtful. "History is complicated, Alicia. You're passionate, I get that. But sometimes it's better to take things step by step. Let's not rush into changes that could disrupt the school's harmony." Alicia felt her cheeks heat up, her hands gripping her pencil tighter. She had heard these arguments before. Teachers who dismissed her concerns, classmates who didn't understand why it mattered. But Alicia wasn't one to back down. She knew her history mattered, and so did the stories of those who had been marginalized throughout time. After class, Alicia stayed behind, her fingers tracing the edge of her desk as she waited for Mr. Davis to finish tidying up his papers. When he finally turned to face her, she spoke. "Mr. Davis, I'm not asking for the entire curriculum to be changed overnight. I'm just asking for a place for Black history to be taught properly. It's part of our history too." Mr. Davis looked at her, his expression unreadable. "Alicia," he said slowly, "I respect your passion, but these discussions take time. The school board isn't ready for something like this." Alicia's jaw tightened, her frustration bubbling just beneath the surface. Why should it take time? Why should we wait? How many more years do we have to feel left out of our own history? Mr. Davis placed his hands on his desk, his fingers steepled as he leaned forward slightly. "I understand your frustration. I do. But let's not make this a battle, Alicia. You'll get your chance to make a difference, but not by going against the system." Alicia's eyes searched his face. "The system isn't perfect. Sometimes it needs to be challenged. That's how change happens." The dismissal hung in the air, heavier than before. Alicia grabbed her bag and headed out, her mind racing. Her classmates slowly filtered out of the room, leaving her alone with her thoughts. She knew this fight wasn't going to be easy, but she was determined to push for what was right. At home, Alicia sat quietly at the kitchen table, her parents preparing dinner nearby. Her father looked up from stirring a pot. "How was school today?" he asked gently. Alicia exhaled slowly. "Same old. Mr. Davis doesn't get it." Her mother placed a plate in front of her. "You'll make him understand, baby. One step at a time." Alicia nodded, but a spark of doubt flickered in her eyes. "I just wish it didn't feel so hard, like I'm always fighting uphill." Her father sat down across from her, resting his hands on the table. "Your fight matters, Alicia. You're standing up for something that so many before you couldn't. The world isn't always fair, but you're pushing to make it better." That night, Alicia fell asleep with a renewed sense of purpose. She knew the road ahead was long, but every step she took brought her closer to a future where Black history was acknowledged and celebrated alongside all other stories in the tapestry of history. The next day, Alicia sat in class, her notebook open and filled with ideas for her research paper. Her mind was buzzing with excitement. Malcolm X, a revolutionary whose words had ignited change and challenged the status quo. To Alicia, his life and legacy were essential to understanding the struggles of Black Americans and the fight for justice. This was the perfect topic for her class project. "All right, Alicia," Mr. Davis began, standing at the front of the classroom. "What topic have you decided on for your research paper?" Alicia smiled confidently. "I'd like to write about Malcolm X," she said, her voice steady. The room fell silent for a moment. Mr. Davis's brow furrowed as he adjusted his glasses, his expression tightening. "Malcolm X? That's an interesting choice." "Yes," Alicia continued, "he was a leader in the civil rights movement who pushed for justice and equality through direct action and advocacy. His story is crucial to understanding the history of Black resistance." Mr. Davis shook his head slightly. "I'm not sure if that's the right fit for this assignment. We should focus on more mainstream historical figures. Figures that unite rather than divide." Alicia's stomach twisted. But Malcolm X's story is just as important. He fought for those who were oppressed and unjustly treated. Why shouldn't we learn about that? Mr. Davis sighed, his expression still firm. "I understand your passion, but history isn't always about individuality. It's about the broader picture. Abraham Lincoln, George Washington, these are figures that shaped the country as a whole." Alicia shook her head. "But by focusing only on those figures, we ignore the struggles of others. We erase the voices of those who weren't in power. It's not complete history." Mr. Davis leaned back against his desk, his arms crossed. "Alicia, I get where you're coming from, but our curriculum is designed to reflect a balanced perspective. Not every story can be told, and we must be careful not to single out specific groups." "But why not?" Alicia pressed, her voice rising slightly. "Malcolm X is part of history. He challenged the nation to confront its injustices, to create change. His story deserves to be heard alongside everyone else's." Mr. Davis's gaze locked onto hers. "Your passion is admirable, Alicia, but sometimes history isn't about individual recognition. It's about the collective effort. Your idea might seem noble, but it's too divisive for this assignment." Alicia felt her cheeks flush with embarrassment. The classroom around her seemed to blur as her heart pounded loudly in her ears. "Divisive? Is it divisive to want equality? To want our stories to be taught alongside everyone else's?" Mr. Davis's lips pressed into a thin line. "Enough," he said, his tone brokering no room for argument. "This conversation is over. Choose another topic." The dismissal rang in Alicia's ears, her pride stinging from the public rejection. She glanced around the room, hoping for some support, but her classmates avoided her gaze, their attention elsewhere. As the class continued, Alicia's hands trembled slightly as she opened her notebook. She couldn't shake the feeling of isolation. She had thought her best friend Riley would stand by her, but Riley had seemed hesitant when Alicia explained her choice. Now she felt completely alone. At home, Alicia couldn't hold back her frustration. "It's not fair," she muttered, pacing back and forth in her room. Her mother sat quietly at her desk, working on a project for her own job. "He just doesn't get it." Her mother looked up, a comforting smile spreading across her face. "He's stuck in a system that doesn't want to change, sweetie. But you know better. You know what's right." Alicia stopped in her tracks, her anger simmering just beneath the surface. "But it feels like no one else cares. They're all afraid to speak up." Her mother's voice was gentle but firm. "Sometimes it only takes one voice to make a difference. You've got courage, Alicia. Keep pushing. One day they'll see." That night, Alicia lay awake in bed, her thoughts racing. Malcolm X's story wasn't going to disappear just because Mr. Davis didn't see its value. Alicia made a silent promise to herself. She would write the paper, regardless of the obstacles. Alicia spent hours poring over books, researching Malcolm X's life and his contributions to civil rights. Every quote, every story became a piece of her presentation. She knew the importance of telling Malcolm's story, even if Mr. Davis didn't see it. The day of her presentation finally arrived. Alicia stood at the front of the classroom, her voice steady, her words filled with conviction. "Today I'll be talking about Malcolm X," Alicia began, her confidence shining through. He was more than an activist. His life was a testament to resilience, to speaking up for justice, and to fighting against oppression. The room fell silent as Alicia shared anecdotes from Malcolm X's life, the struggles he faced, the barriers he broke, and the way his words gave voice to the unheard. Alicia's passion was palpable, her eyes bright with emotion as she spoke. But Mr. Davis sat at his desk with his arms crossed, his face unreadable. When Alicia finished, there was a long pause. "Well," Mr. Davis finally said, his voice calm but cutting, "that was interesting. But let's be honest, Alicia, Malcolm X's story is not as straightforward as you've presented it. History is more than just emotion and quotes. It's about facts, context, and understanding the bigger picture." Alicia's stomach twisted. "I understand that, Mr. Davis, but history is also about representation. Malcolm X's story is part of our history, just like Abraham Lincoln's or George Washington's." Mr. Davis leaned forward slightly, his gaze sharp. "That's where you're mistaken. You can be passionate about Malcolm X's, but his relevance to this assignment is questionable. You failed to meet the standards of historical analysis. Therefore, I'm giving you a failing grade." Alicia's breath hitched. The sting of humiliation cut through her, sharp and bitter. She felt her hands tremble as she stepped back from the front of the room. The classmates who had once seemed supportive now turned their eyes away, their unease palpable. "Mr. Davis," Alicia said quietly, her voice trembling, "you're dismissing not only my work, but the importance of Black voices in history. This isn't just about passing an assignment. It's about acknowledging the stories that have been silenced for too long." Mr. Davis sat back in his chair, his expression cold. "You're being insubordinate, Alicia. This isn't a platform for activism. This is a history class. Your failure to comply with the curriculum speaks volumes." Alicia felt her heart beat faster, the anger inside her simmering. She wanted to argue, to fight back, but the weight of his words pressed down on her like a heavy stone. After class, Alicia gathered her things slowly, her mind racing. She could feel the eyes of her classmates on her, the whispers trailing behind her as she left the room. "Hey," a voice called out softly. It was Riley. Alicia paused, her bag slung over her shoulder. "Riley," Alicia said, her voice quiet but steady. "Why didn't you back me up?" Riley shrugged awkwardly. "I don't know, Alicia. It's complicated. People talk. They say things when you stand out." Alicia shook her head, her frustration bubbling over. "So what? You just go along with it? You let them mock me? I didn't mean to." "Save it, Riley," Alicia cut in, her voice sharp. "You were supposed to be my friend." Riley hesitated, then gave a small nod. "I'll talk to you later." The rest of the day passed in a blur. Alicia sat quietly through her other classes, her mind consumed with the events of the morning. At home, her parents could see the sadness in her eyes, the weight of her fight etched on her face. "You don't have to carry this alone, baby," her mother said softly as she served dinner. "We're here for you." Alicia nodded slowly, but the bitterness didn't fade. She had faced discrimination before, but this felt different, more personal, more oppressive. Her father's voice was steady as he spoke. "You stood up for what you believe in. That's something most people can't do." Days passed and the sting of humiliation began to settle in. Alicia found herself walking the halls of Westbrook High, a constant reminder of the division she now faced. Her classmates whispered behind her back, some laughing quietly as they mocked her for playing the race card. It wasn't just the insults. There was a cold distance, as if Alicia had been cast out from the circle she once belonged to. At lunch, Alicia sat alone at a far table near the window, her tray untouched. She glanced around the cafeteria, watching groups of students talking and laughing together. No one sat near her. Even Riley had stopped joining her. "Hey, Alicia," a familiar voice broke the silence. It was Ms. Carter, the school's Black history teacher, and one of the few educators who had shown support. She sat down across from Alicia, her expression gentle but concerned. Alicia gave a small, hesitant smile. "Hi, Ms. Carter." "You don't have to do this alone," Ms. Carter said softly. "You've got people who believe in you, even if it doesn't feel like it right now." "It feels like everyone's against me," Alicia admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "My classmates, My best friend, even the teachers, they act like what I'm doing is wrong. Ms. Carter gave her a comforting nod. It's not easy standing up for what's right, but history has shown us that change comes from those who refuse to be silenced. But what if it costs too much? Alicia asked, her voice cracking. What if I lose everything? Friends, support, even my future? Ms. Carter took Alicia's hand gently. Sometimes the cost is great, but it's never greater than the cost of silence. You're not alone, Alicia. There are others who've been through this and come out stronger on the other side. That evening, Alicia sat at the dinner table with her parents. The tension in the room was palpable. Her mother tried to keep the conversation light, asking about school and how her day went. Alicia's father, however, was quieter, his eyes focused on his plate, as though lost in thought. "Dad," Alicia said quietly, breaking the silence, "are you worried about what's happening at school?" Her father looked up at her, his expression stern. "Of course I am. We moved here for a reason, to give you a better chance at a good education, to grow up safe. But this isn't what I wanted for you." "It's not just about me," Alicia said, her voice steady. "This is bigger than me. It's about standing up for what's right, even when the whole world is telling you to be quiet." Her father sighed heavily. "I know that, Alicia. But this town, it's not ready. Not everyone here sees things the way we do. They fear change, and fear often leads to hate." Alicia nodded thoughtfully. "But we can't let that fear win. We have to push through it, even if it's hard." "You're strong, Alicia," her mother said softly. "You've always been brave, even when things were tough. Don't let them take that away from you." Determined to uncover the truth, Alicia spent hours digging through old school records and online databases. She didn't trust the information provided by the school administration. Something felt off. There had to be more to Mr. Davis's behavior, more than what was visible on the surface. Late one evening, Alicia found herself in her room, surrounded by stacks of papers and her laptop. Her fingers flew over the keyboard as she searched through various files, looking for any trace of complaints against Mr. Davis. Slowly, details began to surface. Several reports popped up. Anonymous complaints, dismissed without investigation. Some were vague, while others painted a clearer picture of Mr. Davis's actions. Each piece of information revealed a pattern of questionable behavior, especially concerning his treatment of black students. The door to Alicia's room creaked open. It was her mother. "Still working, baby?" she asked softly, peeking inside. Alicia nodded, her eyes focused on the screen. "I have to figure this out, Mom. It's like no one sees what's really happening." Her mother sat down beside her, resting a gentle hand on Alicia's shoulder. "You're brave. You know that, right? Not everyone would go this far." "I have to," Alicia replied, her voice steady. "Someone has to hold him accountable. If the administration won't do it, I will." The next day at school, Alicia sought out Mr. Carter, the supportive Black history teacher who had always been a guiding presence for her. After class, they sat together in a quiet corner of the library, surrounded by books. "I've been looking into Mr. Davis," Alicia began cautiously. "There are complaints about him, ones that seem to vanish into nothing." Mr. Carter sighed, his expression somber. "The system protects its own, Alicia, especially those who have been around for a long time. It's not about what's right, but what's easy." "But this isn't right," Alicia said firmly. "The way he treats Black students, the dismissive attitudes, how can that just be ignored?" Mr. Carter leaned back in his chair, thinking carefully before speaking. "It's a tough battle. You're fighting against years of outdated policies and a fear of change, but it's not impossible. You've seen what speaking up can do." "But I need more," Alicia insisted. "Something solid, evidence." "You'll need to dig deeper," Mr. Carter advised. "Look for patterns. There are usually breadcrumbs left behind, emails, notes, and conversations. You just have to find them." After the meeting, Alicia felt both overwhelmed and energized. She returned home, ready to spend the evening continuing her search. Her father, watching her from the kitchen, quietly observed her determination. "You're like your mother," he said softly, stirring a pot on the stove. "Always pushing for what's right, even when it's hard." Alicia smiled faintly. "Someone has to, Dad, even if they don't want to hear it." That night, Alicia uncovered a crucial piece of evidence, a long-forgotten email exchange between Mr. Davis and another teacher, mocking the inclusion of Black history in the curriculum. The message was damning, the language blatant in its disregard for diversity and inclusion. With this newfound evidence in hand, Alicia knew she had reached a tipping point. The truth couldn't be ignored any longer. She began preparing for the next step, presenting her findings to the school board. Alicia sat in the small, dimly lit office of Mr. Davis, her heart pounding against her chest. The room felt suffocating, and every second felt heavier than the last. She had spent countless nights preparing for this moment, collecting evidence and building her courage. Mr. Davis's office was lined with bookshelves filled with old textbooks, and a desk sat in the center with papers scattered across it. Behind the desk, Mr. Davis stared at her, his expression neutral but stern. "Well, Alicia," he began, his voice cool and measured, "to what do I owe the pleasure today?" Alicia took a deep breath, her voice steady. "I've come to talk about my grade and the way I've been treated in your class. Specifically, how you dismissed my research on Malcolm X without a second thought." Mr. Davis leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled together. "Your research was inappropriate for this class. It lacked relevance and depth." Alicia shook her head. "It wasn't inappropriate, it was important. Malcolm X is a significant figure in history, and his contributions matter. You dismissed my work without considering its value because of your own biases." Mr. Davis's face tightened. "You're mistaken, Alicia. This isn't about race. It's about academic standards, which you've struggled to meet." "It is about race," Alicia countered. "You treat Black students differently. I'm not the first to notice it, and I won't be the last. I've seen the complaints. Dismissed without investigation. The truth is there, whether you like it or not." For a moment, Mr. Davis said nothing. His eyes bore into hers, a storm behind his gaze. Then his voice lowered, colder than before. "You're playing a dangerous game, Alicia. You've crossed a line. If you continue down this path, there will be consequences." Alicia's hands trembled slightly, but her voice remained firm. "I'm not afraid of your threats. The truth will come out. You can't keep covering up your actions forever." "You're making a mistake," Mr. Davis warned, his tone sharp. "You don't understand what you're getting yourself into. This isn't just about grades anymore. This is personal." "I'm not backing down," Alicia said, her voice unwavering. "Your threats won't scare me. I'm ready for the truth to be revealed." Mr. Davis stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "You'll regret this, Alicia. I promise you that." Without another word, he walked toward the door and opened it. Alicia stood up and walked out calmly, her head held high. The door closed behind her with a quiet click. Back in the hallway, Alicia's legs felt heavy, but her heart was lighter. She had faced Mr. Davis head-on, and though the encounter had been tense, it only fueled her determination. The fight for justice wasn't over. Not yet. At home, her parents greeted her with quiet concern. Her mother embraced her tightly while her father gave her a knowing look. "You did the right thing," he said softly. "No matter how hard this gets, we're behind you." Alicia smiled faintly. "I know, and I won't stop until change happens." The school bell rang, signaling the start of history class. Alicia walked into the room with a determined look on her face. Her heart beat faster than usual, but this time it wasn't out of fear. It was out of hope. She had spent the past few days talking to her closest friends and a few classmates she trusted. Together, they decided it was time to take a stand. As the class settled into their seats, Alicia placed a small stack of signs on her desk. The room was quiet, and the usual hum of conversation had been replaced with uneasy anticipation. Alicia glanced around and saw a few of her classmates look at her with curiosity. Others avoided eye contact altogether. Mr. Davis walked into the room and paused at the front of the class, his eyes immediately narrowing when he saw the signs. His gaze shifted from one student to another, his expression darkening with suspicion. "Ms. Johnson," Mr. Davis said sharply, "what is the meaning of this?" Alicia stood slowly, holding up a sign that read, "Our history matters." "This is a protest," she said calmly, "a peaceful one. We're here to show that Black history is important, that the discrimination we face in this school is real, and it needs to be addressed." Mr. Davis's face turned red with anger. "This is disruptive. You will all be sent to the principal's office immediately." Several students hesitated, their hands tightening around their signs. Others stood up, joining Alicia in solidarity. "Let's keep going," Alicia said softly, her voice carrying a quiet strength. "This is bigger than just a single class." One by one, more students joined her. White students, Latino students, Asian students, all standing silently with signs raised high. "Our history matters. Equality now. End racial bias." The classroom fell into a tense, almost reverent silence. Even Mr. Davis seemed taken aback. He stood at the front, his fists clenched at his sides, his jaw tight with frustration. Outside the classroom, whispers spread like wildfire. Other teachers peeked into the room, observing the protest with wide eyes. Administrators soon arrived, their expressions ranging from disbelief to anger. "Sit down immediately," barked the principal, Mr. Reynolds, stepping into the room. His voice echoed sharply, demanding control. Alicia didn't move. "This isn't going to stop just because you want it to, Mr. Reynolds. This school system needs to face the truth. We're tired of being silenced." "Enough," Mr. Reynolds snapped. "This behavior is unacceptable. You will all be suspended." "But we're speaking up for what's right," Alicia shouted back, her voice rising. "How many more times do we have to be ignored? Black students deserve to be heard." Mr. Reynolds glared at her, but the weight of the protest was difficult to ignore. More students had gathered outside the classroom, pressing their faces against the windows. They held their signs high, their expressions filled with solidarity. Inside the room, the tension reached a breaking point. Mr. Davis attempted to continue teaching, but his voice trembled, unable to hide his frustration. Some students began chanting softly, "Our history matters," a chorus that grew louder with each passing second. The protest had spread beyond the classroom walls. Teachers and staff stopped in the hallways, watching in awe as the movement grew. It wasn't just about a single history class anymore. It was a collective call for change. After what felt like an eternity, Mr. Reynolds sighed heavily. "This will be dealt with," he said through gritted teeth, "but you will not get away with this." Alicia lowered her sign but kept her eyes fixed on him. "We already aren't, and we won't stop." The protest slowly came to an end. Students quietly sat back down, their signs still clutched tightly in their hands. Mr. Davis dismissed the class early, his frustration evident in every movement. As Alicia walked out of the room, she felt a rush of emotions: pride, hope, and determination. She knew the fight wasn't over, but for now she had taken a step toward change. The next day, Alicia walked into history class with a sense of unease. She wasn't sure what to expect after the protest. The hallway buzzed with whispers, and students watched her as she passed. She knew things were going to get worse, but she wasn't prepared for how fast the retaliation would come. Mr. Davis was waiting at the front of the class, his expression cold and dismissive. As Alicia took her seat, he began handing out assignments for the week. However, when Alicia received hers, she immediately noticed something was different. The points had been significantly reduced from her previous grades. "Mr. Davis," Alicia said softly, raising her hand, "why is my grade so low?" Mr. Davis didn't look at her directly. "Your work has been unsatisfactory. Perhaps you need to reconsider your approach." "But I worked hard," Alicia insisted, her voice steady despite the disappointment. "You can't keep punishing me for speaking up. This isn't fair." "Fairness has nothing to do with it," Mr. Davis snapped. "You are a disruption to this class, and until you learn your place, your grades will reflect that." Alicia sat back in her seat, her heart racing. She knew this was more than a simple grading issue. It was retaliation. After the protest, Mr. Davis had made it clear that he wouldn't allow her to succeed. And when she looked around the classroom, she saw the other students watching with pity or discomfort. Many of them said nothing, afraid of the backlash. After class, Alicia tried to speak with Mr. Davis again, but he waved her off with a dismissive hand. "Don't waste my time, Ms. Johnson. You've made your point." Frustrated and defeated, Alicia went straight to the principal's office. Mr. Edwards listened quietly as she explained the situation, her voice calm but firm. She laid out the evidence. her lowered grades, the mistreatment, and pleaded for help. "I understand your concerns," Mr. Edwards said finally, "but this is a delicate situation. Mr. Davis is a respected teacher, and your actions have been disruptive." "I'm not being disruptive," Alicia argued. "I'm speaking up for what's right. Mr. Davis's retaliation is unfair and discriminatory." "I appreciate your passion, Alicia," Mr. Edwards replied, "but insubordination will not be tolerated. If you continue to challenge authority, it could affect your future at this school." Alicia clenched her fists, her jaw tight. "I'm not backing down. This is bigger than grades. It's about justice, and I will not stop fighting for it." Mr. Edwards sighed and leaned back in his chair, clearly frustrated. "You're a bright student, Alicia, but sometimes personal battles can lead to unintended consequences." "They're not personal battles," Alicia corrected him. "They're necessary ones." The conversation ended there, with Mr. Edwards offering little else in the way of support. Alicia left the office feeling powerless, but her resolve only deepened. She wasn't going to let this go. She couldn't. That evening, Alicia's parents sat with her, listening as she recounted the day's events. Her mother looked worried, but her father's expression was steady, full of quiet encouragement. "You've done nothing wrong," he said firmly. "The school can't take away your voice. Keep pushing forward." "We'll stand with you," her mother added, holding Alicia's hand tightly. "No matter how hard this gets, we'll be here." The next few weeks were a whirlwind of meetings and accusations. Mr. Davis continued to penalize Alicia's work, grading her assignments harshly and treating her with increasing hostility. Some classmates avoided her altogether, while others watched from a distance, unsure of how to help. Yet through it all, Alicia's determination remained unshaken. Every unfair grade, every insult, every cold look only fueled her fight. She knew the system was flawed, and the more she uncovered, the clearer it became that change was not going to come easily. But she wasn't going to let that discourage her. One afternoon, Alicia sat in the library, flipping through her research materials. Her mind was sharp, her focus relentless. Every word she read was another piece of the puzzle, a puzzle she was determined to solve, even if it meant going against the very institution that was supposed to educate her. Alicia sat at the kitchen table, her notebook open in front of her, but her mind was far away. The past few weeks had been a blur of tension, unfair grades, and strained relationships with her classmates and teachers. She knew that fighting for justice wasn't going to be easy, but the weight of the battle was starting to feel overwhelming. Her mother walked into the room, holding a folder in her hands. "Alicia, we've got something important to discuss," she said, setting the folder down. Alicia looked up, her curiosity piqued. "What is it?" Her mother sat down beside her. "I reached out to a civil rights lawyer. They've reviewed everything, from the complaints you filed to the treatment you've received." Alicia's eyes widened. "What did they say?" "The lawyer believes we have a solid case. They'll help us file a formal grievance against the school district," her mother explained, her voice steady with determination. "We're not going to let them sweep this under the rug anymore." Alicia felt a rush of relief mixed with renewed energy. She knew this wasn't going to be an easy road, but having legal support made her feel like she wasn't fighting alone. "Thank you, Mom. This means a lot." Meanwhile, outside the school, Ms. Lewis, the janitor, swept the hallway slowly, his expression thoughtful. He often noticed how Alicia carried herself with quiet strength, even during the hardest moments. One afternoon, after a particularly long day, he pulled her aside. "Alicia," he said gently, "can I share something with you?" Alicia turned to face him, her curiosity piqued. "Of course, Mr. Lewis. What's on your mind?" "I used to work here years ago," he began, his voice calm but filled with wisdom. "Back then, things were worse. Teachers like Mr. Davis used their power to silence students who spoke up. I fought back once, just like you, and I was silenced too. They didn't listen to my complaints. They tried to make me disappear." Alicia listened intently, her expression solemn. "What did you do?" "I kept pushing," he said with a small smile. "It wasn't easy, but eventually more people started to see the truth. It wasn't just about me anymore. It was about the students who came after me." Tears welled up in Alicia's eyes as she absorbed his words. "That's what I'm trying to do. I don't want anyone else to feel what I've felt." Exactly, Mr. Lewis said firmly. You've got strength they didn't expect. Don't let them break you. The next few days were filled with meetings, paperwork, and discussions with the lawyer. Alicia pored over every detail, making sure nothing was overlooked. Her classmates who had seen her courage began to reach out more, offering their support. It wasn't always vocal, but it was there, a quiet understanding that they were in this together. At home, Alicia's father sat down with her one evening. "How's everything going?" he asked, his voice calm but curious. Alicia took a deep breath, smiling softly. "It's tough, but it's getting clearer. The more I learn, the more I know we're right." Her father gave her a proud nod. "That's all that matters. You're standing up for what's right, even when it's hard." Days turned into weeks, and the formal grievance progressed. The school district couldn't ignore the mounting evidence or the growing support behind Alicia's cause. While Mr. Davis continued to resist, the pressure from outside began to crack the walls of the school's indifference. One afternoon, Alicia was called into a meeting with the district superintendent. His office was spacious, filled with documents and framed awards. He offered her a seat, but his smile didn't quite reach his eyes. "I've reviewed the situation," he began, his tone measured. "It's clear that there have been some concerns raised." Alicia crossed her arms, her gaze steady. "Concerns? They're not just concerns. They're blatant acts of discrimination." The superintendent nodded slowly. "That's understood. We are working on a resolution, but these things take time." Alicia shook her head. "Time isn't what we need. Justice is what we need." The superintendent was silent for a moment, then spoke again. "We're committed to making changes, but we must proceed carefully to ensure fairness for all parties involved." Alicia stood up, a faint smile playing on her lips. "Fairness has been absent for too long. Change will happen." Leaving the meeting, Alicia felt a renewed sense of hope. The battle wasn't over yet, but the tide was shifting. With every step forward, her strength grew. She knew she had already made a difference, and that was just the beginning. Alicia sat in the front row of the school auditorium, her palms sweating as she held tightly onto her notes. The room buzzed with quiet conversations, but the tension in the air was palpable. Tonight was the night, a school board meeting where she hoped to speak her truth and push for change. The school board members were seated at a long table at the front of the room. Mr. Edwards, the principal, looked stern, his eyes scanning the crowd. Mr. Davis sat quietly next to him, his expression impassive but tense. Alicia's heart raced as she focused on the task ahead. When her name was called, she stood up slowly and made her way to the microphone. The auditorium was silent as she adjusted the microphone. She took a deep breath and began to speak. "My name is Alicia Johnson," she started, her voice steady but firm. "I'm here to address the issue of racial discrimination at Westbrook High School." There were murmurs of agreement and a few nods from the crowd. Alicia continued, her words cutting through the tension in the room. "For months, I've been the target of biased treatment from my history teacher, Mr. Davis. My grades have been unfairly lowered, my ideas dismissed, and my voice silenced because of my race." Alicia's voice grew stronger, her passion evident. "This isn't just about me. It's about the countless students who face similar discrimination every day. Students who are overlooked, dismissed, and penalized because of the color of their skin." Mr. Davis shifted in his seat, his jaw clenched, but he said nothing. Alicia noticed the way his fingers drummed lightly on the armrest, betraying his discomfort. Mr. Edwards, however, maintained his calm composure, watching the proceedings with a neutral expression. "I've done my research," Alicia continued. "Mr. Davis has a history of complaints, most of which have been ignored or dismissed by the administration. This isn't about one isolated incident. It's a systemic issue." The crowd murmured in agreement, their voices rising slightly. Alicia took another deep breath, pressing on. "Tonight, I'm asking for accountability. I'm asking for change, not just for me, but for every student who deserves a fair and inclusive education." Several parents and students stood up in support, sharing their own experiences of discrimination. A father spoke about how his daughter had been penalized for speaking up in her classes. A mother shared how her son had been given unfair grades on assignments when he questioned teachers' biases. "Enough is enough," one woman shouted from the audience. "We won't stand for this anymore." The room grew louder with every passing moment, voices echoing in unison. Even Mr. Edwards looked troubled, his expression softening slightly as the testimonies poured in. He glanced at Mr. Davis, who sat stiffly, his face a mask of indifference. After several heartfelt speeches, the school board members conferred quietly for a moment. Mr. Edwards stood again, addressing the room. "We hear your concerns," he began. "The board takes these issues seriously, and we will conduct a thorough investigation into the allegations against Mr. Davis." Alicia's heart lifted slightly, but she knew this wasn't the end. "Thank you, Mr. Edwards," she said, her voice strong. "But this can't just be an investigation. It has to lead to real change." Mr. Davis rose abruptly from his seat, his face red with anger. "This is a smear campaign," he declared, his voice rising above the crowd. "These accusations are unfounded." The room quieted down slightly as people turned to look at him. Alicia's eyes locked onto his, unflinching. "No, Mr. Davis," Alicia said firmly. "It's not a smear campaign. It's the truth." Mr. Davis's gaze bore into hers, his expression full of fury, but he didn't respond further. Instead, he stormed out of the room, slamming the door behind him. The room erupted once again into applause, louder and more heartfelt this time. People cheered, and a sense of solidarity filled the auditorium. Parents hugged their children, students whispered in support, and hope seemed to shine in every corner of the room. Alicia smiled, feeling a sense of accomplishment and determination. The path forward was still uncertain, but tonight had been a turning point. The school board had committed to investigating, and that was a step in the right direction. "We've made progress," Alicia said, her voice carrying over the room, "but we must continue to hold them accountable. Our history and our stories matter." As the meeting concluded, Alicia felt a renewed sense of purpose. The fight wasn't over, but tonight she had taken a stand, and she knew she wouldn't back down. Days turned into weeks, and the investigation into Mr. Davis's conduct deepened. Alicia's determination never wavered. She knew the fight wasn't over, but every day brought new revelations that made the situation more serious. More students and staff began to come forward, sharing their experiences of Mr. Davis's biased behavior. Alicia worked tirelessly, collecting stories, documents, and evidence. Her focus was sharp, and her resolve was unbreakable. She wanted to ensure that Mr. Davis faced the consequences of his actions. One afternoon, Alicia sat in the school library, surrounded by books and her laptop. Her fingers flew across the keyboard as she sifted through emails and old files. It was during this research that she stumbled upon something shocking, a key piece of evidence hidden in plain sight. It was an email from years ago, addressed to another teacher, mocking the inclusion of Black history in the curriculum. The message was laced with derogatory language, ridiculing efforts to teach the struggles and achievements of Black figures. Alicia's breath hitched as she read it, the weight of the discovery settling heavily on her shoulders. "This changes everything," Alicia whispered, her heart pounding. She quickly printed the email and took it to Ms. Carter, the supportive Black teacher who had guided her throughout the process. Ms. Carter's eyes widened as she read the email. "This is damning, Alicia," she said softly. "This is proof of intentional discrimination." Together, they reviewed the email, carefully drafting a formal complaint to present to the school board. Alicia felt a renewed sense of urgency. Mr. Davis couldn't escape this. His actions were now indisputable. Meanwhile, the school board's investigation was ongoing. More students and teachers spoke out about Mr. Davis's behavior, providing damning testimony. The atmosphere in the school had shifted. Fear of retaliation was replaced with a collective determination for change. One afternoon, the school board convened again, this time for a more decisive session. Alicia, along with her parents and Ms. Carter, were present to speak on the latest findings. The room was packed, and the energy was charged with anticipation. As Alicia stood before the board, the weight of the moment pressed down on her. She held the printout of the email tightly in her hands, ready to present it as evidence. Her voice was steady as she spoke. "Mr. Davis's actions have not only harmed me, but many others," Alicia began. "This email proves beyond a shadow of a doubt that his bias was intentional and deliberate." The board members listened intently, some exchanging serious glances while others looked visibly uncomfortable. Alicia's parents stood nearby, offering silent support, while Ms. Carter stood beside her with a look of quiet pride. Mr. Davis, seated at the end of the table, shifted uncomfortably, his face a mix of anger and humiliation. He tried to maintain a composed exterior, but the weight of the evidence was overwhelming. "You can deny it all you want," Alicia continued, her voice unwavering, "but this email shows your true feelings toward Black history, and that's unacceptable in a school that claims to value diversity and inclusion." The room grew tense as Alicia concluded her speech. Mr. Edwards cleared his throat, signaling a break for discussion among the board members. When the discussion resumed, Mr. Edwards stood, his expression serious. "The evidence presented is disturbing," he said. "The board takes this matter very seriously." Alicia felt her breath catch in her throat, her heart racing with hope. Mr. Edwards continued, "Mr. Davis will be placed on administrative leave pending a thorough investigation. We will ensure that appropriate steps are taken to address this issue." There was a murmur of approval from the audience, a mixture of applause and nods. Alicia's parents hugged her tightly, tears of relief in their eyes. "This isn't just about justice for me," Alicia said softly, standing tall. "It's about ensuring that every student feels safe, valued, and respected in this school." The meeting ended on a hopeful note, but Alicia knew the real work had just begun. Mr. Davis's resignation was not the end. It was just the beginning of a long journey toward a more inclusive and equitable school system. As she left the room, Alicia felt a wave of gratitude wash over her. She had fought not just for herself, but for every student who had been silenced. The battle wasn't over, but the foundation for change had been laid. The investigation concluded with Mr. Davis being forced to resign. The news spread like wildfire throughout Westbrook High. It wasn't just a victory for Alicia, it was a triumph for every student who had ever felt excluded, belittled, or unheard. The school board took swift action, implementing new diversity training and revising the curriculum to include voices that had been marginalized for too long. Alicia stood in the halls on her first day back after the announcement. The air was different, lighter, more inclusive. The classrooms were buzzing with discussions about leaders like Rosa Parks, Frederick Douglass, and Ida B. Wells. These stories, once overlooked or brushed aside, now held a central place in the history lessons. Students from different backgrounds sat together, sharing perspectives and learning from one another. For Alicia, it was a moment she would never forget. The fight had been long and difficult, but in this moment, she could see the change taking shape. Her voice, though once small and timid in the face of opposition, had become a powerful symbol for justice and equality. "It's amazing to see the difference," Alicia said softly to her best friend Riley during lunch. "Our history is no longer just about the same old stories. It's about all of us." Riley nodded enthusiastically, her eyes shining with pride. "You've done something incredible, Alicia. This isn't just about what happened with Mr. Davis. It's about what's happening now and what will happen in the future." Alicia smiled, but her thoughts drifted back to the tough moments, the times when she had been alone, when her peers had questioned her actions, and when Mr. Davis's harsh words echoed in her ears. Yet through it all, her determination never wavered. She had learned that change isn't always easy, but it's always worth fighting for. At home, Alicia spoke with her parents about the changes happening at school. Her father, who had once worried about the community's reaction to her activism, now felt a sense of pride. "You've set a powerful example," he said, ruffling her hair gently, "for all of us." Her mother, eyes bright with emotion, hugged her tightly. "You've changed things, sweetheart. More than just in school, you've inspired a movement." Throughout the school year, Alicia continued to lead. She helped organize workshops, created discussion groups, and even collaborated with other schools in the district to share ideas and push for more inclusive practices. The sense of community was stronger than ever before. The teachers, once hesitant about the changes, grew to understand the importance of representation and diversity. Ms. Carter, the supportive Black teacher who had guided Alicia from the start, became a mentor to many students. Together, they worked to ensure that the school's curriculum reflected the truth of history, not just the sanitized versions. "I've seen the difference," Ms. Carter said during a staff meeting. "These young minds deserve to learn the full story. And thanks to Alicia's courage, we're on the right path." As the end of the school year approached, Alicia gave a speech during the school's annual assembly. She spoke about her journey, about the struggles she faced, and the victory she achieved. But her message wasn't just about herself. It was about the collective effort that had made change possible. "This isn't just my victory," Alicia said, her voice steady and clear. "This is a victory for all of us who believe that every voice matters. We've shown that when we come together, we can create a future where everyone feels valued, respected, and heard." The crowd erupted into applause, and Alicia felt a wave of emotions wash over her. She had fought not only for herself, but for every student who would walk through those halls in the future. On her way home that evening, Alicia reflected on everything she had accomplished. Her journey had been difficult, filled with challenges and setbacks, but it had taught her an invaluable lesson. Change is never easy, but it is always worth the fight. And as long as there were voices willing to stand up, justice would prevail.